This
Thank you
conference will
very
now
much.
be recorded.
Well, right. Okay, so we're now recording. Thank you very much, Adrian, for that introduction. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you this evening. It's nice to be invited back. Um, yes, my topic tonight is about resilience and about more than resilience, to go beyond resilience. I've called it a black swan strategy. As you know, black swans are the sort of things you never expect to see that suddenly crop up. Um, and we've seen a lot of those recently. I think the unprecedented has become the word of our times. We had an unprecedented use of the word unprecedented. Um, well, with the pandemic and the wide range of global warming, extreme weather events, we've had lots of unprecedented there. Brexit, AI, and geopolitics have also come along and been unprecedented. And then Russia invaded Ukraine. So it's been a bit strange. And that's led people to think, well, perhaps this idea of forecasting the future and making plans for the future isn't all that it's cracked up to be, that we need to be able to do something else. Um, Lots of things are not turning out as you might have expected them to. Um, so, what can we do instead? And the idea was that if you build a resilient organization, then it doesn't really matter what the shocks that actually occur are. You don't have to focus the specific shock that's going to come, but you've got an organization that is then able to react to those shocks, roll with the blows, as it were, and come on to the other side. Um, so the ability to react and respond is what we're talking about in terms of resilience. In the past, lots of organizations have focused on efficiency. Efficiency has been the sort of byword. And the thing about efficiency is that you have less slack in the system. Um, so that when shocks do occur, you've got less capability to react. So you would have to start addressing the question of to what extent do you want to sacrifice short-term profitability for long-term success? What type of organization are you? Are you one that's looking for the long term, in which case building resilience into your organization is important, um, or are you just one that's picking up the scraps as you go along? So that's really the sort of basic issue that we're trying to address. Now, the Boston Consulting Group came up with a rather nice model of resilience, I thought, because what do we actually mean when we talk about being resilient? It's easy to say you want to be resilient, but what do you actually have to do to become resilient? What does it actually mean? Now, their model had these 6 steps in it. The first step was actually anticipation and prudence, and I'll come back to those at the end because I think in most people's minds those are slightly different from the main thrust of what a resilient organization is. That's the anticipation bit is important, and that's a bit of my and beyond discussion really that I'll come to later in the presentation. So they, being Boston Consulting Group, of course, they try to put numbers and graphs on everything, and they broke the things up into cushioning and adaptation, and came up with a nice little graph like that. And they even put a number on how much value there was to it. Personally, I never put much faith in those numbers, but the concept seems fine. That it's a resilient organisation, you're going to be able to bounce back from the shock faster than if you a non-resilient one. So, the first aspect that they talked about was redundancy. Now, this is really a shock to a lot of the management consultancy stuff that's been going on in recent years, where everyone's trying to become efficient. Um, Having spare resources sticking around, not doing anything at the moment, is not really what most of the efficient organisations think about. But if you don't have spare resources sitting around, then when that shock hits, then you're not going to be able to respond appropriately. Now there are different aspects to this. There's firstly there's physical stocks in reserve. So rather than just-in-time systems, which have again have been very popular in recent years, when you have shocks to the supply chains that you have around the world, whether it's because of an aggressive invasion or whether it's because of a pandemic or whatever, having stocks in reserve gives you that flexibility to be able to carry on trading and carry on working, and being able to cope with those intermittent disruptions. Even if you don't have to go as dramatic as the war in Ukraine, but extreme weather events are going to disrupt supply chains quite easily, and we're expecting a lot more of those over the coming years. So actually building in some stocks into your supply chain is a key thing. Just as important is your people. Do you have enough staff with time to react? You can't actually work everyone flat out all the time. The NHS has been pushed to sort of burnout levels in terms of its staff having to cope with the pandemic and so forth. So you actually do need some people who are probably sitting around not doing a great deal from time to time. So you need to be able to cope with the surge of demand. So you need a surge response. In some organizations, you may be able to have reservists and temps and overtime as ways of building a surge response of staff capabilities. Certainly in the NHS, that's what they tried to do. They tried to call up retired doctors and nurses and so forth to help out. And certainly in something in the sort of police and military, you see quite often with overtime being cancelled, leave being cancelled, and other sort of people being drafted in. So you actually do need the capability so that you're not working everyone flat out all the time. So when a shock hits, they can then produce some extra effort and build that in and respond. You can also build in an organizational thing of sort of strategy first aid, as I've called it, sort of high impact teams who can just be wheeled in to deal with major emergencies and issues as you need them. So just as you have first aiders and fire marshals in your organizations, you could have these strategic eagles who sort of fly in to tackle these business emergencies as and when it's necessary. So you have people who could call off their day jobs, as it were, drafting as a sort of hit squad to deal with the shock that's just occurred. So whatever the exact nature of the challenge, these people will have been trained in how to respond and how to implement contingency plans, how to bring together teams and resources. They'll know their way around the organization. They'll know who to call, who to speak to, how to get things done. So they're spearheading a response to the shock that's hit you, whatever that might be. You also actually need your financial reserves. Many organizations actually work on very sort of tight budgets and tight arrangements and utilize financial engineering to manipulate profits and so forth. But if you don't have those financial reserves in terms of, say, for example, an above average cash to operating cost ratio, then you won't have the same flexibility of response that other organizations might have. And so when the unexpected hits, you're not able to finance it, you're not able to respond to it in the way that it deserves. So that was the first of the BCG concepts, and I think it's probably one of the most important. It's one of the ones that people have talked about quite a bit in the press and so forth. And in terms of the pandemic, for example, a lot of people were saying, well, the NHS in particular was already stretched before the pandemic hit, and that made its ability to cope and respond rather less than it might have been. Next up was this concept of diversity, and this again is a fairly obvious point, perhaps, but it's one that people don't necessarily build into all their strategic plans as well as they might. Clearly, if you're an organization which relies on one product and one customer, you've got all your eggs in the one basket, and you're you're going to struggle if there are problems with that product or with that customer. So an over-reliance on a narrow market, whether it's products, markets, regions, or even particular customer types, then that's a challenge. So organizations should look to diversify their revenue sources as much as they can, bringing up a range of products, a range of markets, and a range of customers. And similarly, on the supply side, you have the equivalent challenge that if you're reliant on one or two suppliers in Ukraine, then you're going to be in difficulty at the moment. If you're reliant on Russia for your gas supplies, you're going to be in difficulty as well. So actually having a range of suppliers and a range of supply chains you can call upon, even if you don't, if you have a priority one, which is perhaps most cost effective, but you have others in reserve that you can switch on and off as you need them, then that's quite an important element of building resilience into your organization. One of the things that Boston Consulting Group didn't really identify, but we at SAMI think is really an important point, though, is the diversity of people themselves. Building diversity into your strategic thinking and your planning and the way you move things forward, that does tend to give you a more creative and more flexible approach to the way the world is working, and it allows you to perhaps to avoid the groupthink that can come with a narrow set of views from sort of old white pale males like me. So that you do need to actually have that sort of diversity built into your organizational structure to get that creativity and flexibility into your responses. Otherwise, you tend to end up doing the same old things, reacting in the same old ways, and therefore getting the same old challenges and the same old problems. Okay, excuse me a moment. Modularity was another one of the BCG concepts. And the point about this is to reduce the risk of a systemic failure, to reduce the risk of different bits of the organization interacting in such a way that they bring each other down. So you want to reduce that interconnectedness. You want to be able to produce separate production processes and separate supply chain elements so you can switch them on and off and build them up into different shapes as you need them and as different events occur. So that you get a substitutability within your system, within the whole network of what you're doing, which allows you to be able to switch in and out of the elements as you need. And an important element of this also is the financial separation between different parts of your organization. Insofar as possible, you don't want a failure of one group or one division to be bankrupting the whole organization. You need an organizational financial structure that allows you to be able to discard one or two elements should the need arise, should circumstances change and make that particular aspect of your business no longer viable. So actually the modularity bit there's two parts to it really. It's the sort of modularity in the sense of being able to easily replicate and replace elements that you can just switch in and out, but there's also the reduced interconnectedness. So each element, it stands alone to a larger extent. Okay. One of the other concepts that they came up, which was very new to me, I thought it was a really interesting and innovative idea, was this one of embeddedness. What they mean by that is how an organization fits into the social structure around it, and rather than and if it's able to get support from the social structure around it, that it's going to be more resilient. It's going to be able to respond to different things around it, so that it aligns better with the social system, with its customers' values, and so it's more attuned to value changes within society, It recognizes that certain people now start to believe in a community approach and a community contribution. And the term social capital comes in rather strongly when you start talking about this, about how you're actually able to build up a loyalty an affiliation with your customers, so that they respond to you and react to you. We saw quite a bit of that during the pandemic. Many of these sort of say smaller restaurants, for example, were able to build on their relationships with their customers, so they were able to react and act differently by sending takeaway systems, takeaway foods, for example, and the people who actually were prepared to return to those organisations because they recognised their contribution to the local community. And actually, it's that sort of community element that works well. So smaller businesses tend to do that naturally, but for larger organisations, you have the CSR and ESG systems that come in that people are built in. And the question really is, are you making those really work, or are they just box ticking exercises? Are they just something that goes into the annual report, or are they something which is actually genuinely building a relationship with your community, with your customer base, and your supplier base? Because again, loyalty with suppliers is also an important element of this sort of embeddedness concept. That if you're just trying to minimize the cost of your suppliers all the time, rather than recognizing the contribution they can make to your business, and perhaps a strategic contribution in terms of innovation as well, then you're actually losing out on the capabilities that you will need as a resilient organization. Adaptation is perhaps also regarded as flexibility. So how easily can you respond when that shock hits? First, there's the two real sort of elements. First is the capacity and the capability for experimentation, being willing and able to try out new approaches, to try out new things, to try new products and new markets to see whether they offer relief from the crisis. So you've got to have people and systems and processes and a culture really that's prepared to say, okay, the world has changed, we've got to try something new. What new are we going to try? How are we going to try to build that? And just have a go at that regardless. This is quite common in the sort of Silicon Valley concept of failing fast. So that you try something, if it doesn't work, you ditch it, and then you try something else. And those are the things that's one key strand that you need to try and build into your organizational concepts and your organizational culture to be able to get resilience to that. The other thing is this agility and responsiveness. How easily can you change your attitudes and change your decision making? Typically, this requires an element of decentralized decision making. A bureaucratic system, centralized, can be very hard to change and very hard to react to the changing environment. So the agility and the license to do something different when different circumstances arrive is an important element of building resilience into your organization. So that key element of that. Boston Consulting Group, surprisingly, seemed to think that algorithmic decision making would help with that. I think the idea was that would give you a speed of reaction that you wouldn't get from just people sitting around and chatting about things. Personally, I'm not so convinced about that, because if we're talking about radical changes of the scale of pandemic or Brexit or whatever, then the algorithms built on historical responses I feel that are not going to be so capable of delivering you a successful outcome. So that was just an aside, it's something which I tend to disagree with the BCG about. But otherwise, I think these two elements of experimentation and agility are important. You have to think also, I suppose, about the type of business you're in. Some businesses are inherently going to be harder to react quickly. So that sort of if you're in a major infrastructure industry, for example, um, then that can be difficult to respond quickly. Whereas if you're in obviously in fast-moving consumer goods, then responsiveness and agility is what you're all about all the time. And it can be that you need to think about how you break up the organizational culture. I used to work for BT, um, which most of it is actually effectively a big civil engineering business about building a physical network in the street. But at the time as the internet was coming in and all of the other innovations around that, there was also a separate area which was moving much more quickly than the basic infrastructure side, and required a different culture and different set of approaches. Um, and organizationally, BT responded by splitting itself up into different chunks, and having effectively different cultures and different management styles within each of those divisions, recognizing the different pressures that they were under. So I think that's quite an important thing to think about in this concept too. Excuse me. BCG calls the next concept shaping, and by that it's really the point they're making is that crises aren't just about um, challenges and risks. They create opportunities too, and the good resilient organizations will respond to the new opportunities that change creates. And so there'll be new markets, new products, new processes. You'll have seen, you'll have brought people in to do roles under pressure, and you'll have seen individuals who perhaps responded better than you might have expected, and that are now can be promoted to different roles in the organisation, rewarded for their efforts, but also you've actually seen them respond in different ways, and to see how um, effectively they can perform. So that's the important characteristic as well as the actual product side of it. So being the first to react and seize the new opportunities puts you at the front of the game, ahead of the pack by the time the dust has settled from the immediate crisis, and you've been able to position yourself into the new realities. The point about financial resilience and speed of reaction, as I said, it depends on what sort of industry you're in. You actually need the sort of resilience around that from long-term infrastructure companies where you can pick up, or the ones where you can pick up on trends more quickly. So the longer it's going to take you a long time to change if you're in say an infrastructure business. So therefore you need to be looking further ahead. So you need to be able to match what you know to be your speed of reaction to the timescale of your foresight. So when you are actually trying to think about scenarios of the future and how the future might turn out, you need to look that much further ahead if your business is going to take 10 years to make any real change, as opposed to if you're in the software business, then you can probably change things overnight, and your foresight doesn't need to be so sophisticated. So those are the main bits that BCG came up with in describing what resilience actually means to your organization. Um, but I wanted to also talk about going beyond resilience. Just because shocks like um, invasions and pandemics do happen, doesn't mean you should stop thinking about the future at all. Yes, building an organization which is resilient in the sense of able to respond is good, but also one that is able to anticipate and prepare contingency plans is even better. That you can build some scenarios for the future. You can think of different ways the future is going to turn out, which can be quite radically different in many respects. There's a scenario across you've got on the slide here now describes some particular scenarios we did in a project for the European Health and Safety Agency, and the sort of futures of work varied dramatically from ones where you have a sort of gig economy and a low growth environment to ones where there's a common united approach to exploiting new technologies and taking things forward. So you can build some contingency plans, and typically what we in SAMI these days talk about is something we call an adaptive plan. So you build something which you might call a base case plan, and then watch out for the trigger points, watch out for things which are telling you that the world is changing, and then start to build in the contingency plans that you want. Now, for the UK government, in fact, actually has something called the National Risk Assessment, and a pandemic was always high on the National Risk Assessment as something that could occur, and indeed they did run some exercises against what would happen should a pandemic occur. But one of the things that's tricky is that when the shock hits, it might be sort of in the same area as you expected. It could be a pandemic, but it may have slightly different characteristics. The UK government was preparing for a flu epidemic, whereas the coronavirus one has different characteristics and behaves in slightly different ways. Some of the same things you will need, the PPE you'd needed in both cases, dare I say, body bags you'd need in both cases, but you actually need to think about how things are different, and that's why I think it took a while before we shifted from hand washing to mask wearing, because people hadn't actually thought through what would happen. So no matter how good your contingency plans are, they probably aren't going to match the exact circumstances of the event that occurs, and then you need to respond. But you also have to decide when to act. You have to look at what's happening. You have to monitor the situation and make sure you've got the lines of communication up to decision makers. So you may well have had a team who were monitoring how the pandemic was flowing, but when you hit certain trigger points, like say, for example, the virus appearing in Italy, then that should be flagged really urgently, then up the scale for a reaction and a triggering of the contingency plans. And so you're going to have to adapt, reflect, and monitor again. And it's going to be a cyclical thing. So a one-off, although it might feel like a one-off hit, it's going to be actually an adaptation as you accept the uncertainty and explore the possible new worlds and work on through all of those things. The other point about resilience is that the word itself sort of implies about trying to maintain the status quo, that you're resilient if you're able to stay as you were. Whereas actually more important will be not just keeping the status quo, but responding to the new normal. It's an expression that we've heard a lot more of recently, but it's actually one that, although it applies to the pandemic, it also applies to things that you need to look at with so that you're now building your organization or adapting your organization to cope with the different circumstances that have emerged because of the shock that occurred. So if your suppliers go out of business, then you bring in new suppliers. So that's very obvious. But it's a different sort of scale that you need to be able to understand what the new normal is going to be, so that in the other slogan of our times, you can build back better. So you end up actually with an organization which is better suited to its environment than it was before. Because bear in mind, change doesn't actually have to be on the massive scale of the pandemic or warfare. Change is happening in all ways, in minor respects, all the time. And you're going to be able to need to make sure that you're responding to those changes and building a new organization for each of those smaller changes that go forward. Part of that is also about having a vision and actually driving forward for something in particular that you want the organization to be, rather than simply reacting to circumstances. So that you can, through your vision, actually drive change in the environment you're working in, and create a new environment to your own, which suits your capabilities and suits your competitive advantage. As I said before, crisis creates opportunities too, so you need to make sure that you're embracing those changes and making the most of the learning and the opportunities that come from that. Nicholas Taleb, who wrote the Black Swan book, also came up with the concept of something called anti-fragile. So that the idea was that when change happened and shocks occurred, the organization became better. So the sort of classical model for this is the Hydra. So when you chop off one head, it grows two more. So it's actually stronger and fitter than it was before the shock hit. And that's the sort of concept you're looking for within your organization to do that. You can also create your own change. You don't have to wait for external crises and external shocks to occur. You can, if you wish, deliberately disrupt your organization, deliberately create circumstances that people have to respond to. Well, again, going back to my BT experience, BT used to regularly centralize or decentralize its operations. And you used to think, well, why have we gone back to what we did before? And the answer was you weren't. You were going back by shaking things up. You created the circumstances in which people invented new ideas and invented new responses to the market. And that they then responded better to those different circumstances. And it may be that by, say, decentralizing, you're creating a lot of opportunities. The BT expression was let 1,000 flowers bloom. So lots of people could come up with new ideas. And then you see which are the best of those, and then go back to the concept of best practice, bring everyone back into working on that particular concept. So it feels very disruptive, but it can be a way of unleashing the creativity and inventiveness of your organization to be able to create new ideas and respond to the changing world that's around you. And our final point really is that you should actually think in terms of training in futures, that you want people who actually understand that the world isn't going to just be the same all the time, and that they do want to have a think about how the world could change and how they might respond to that. So if you had, for example, a small foresight team, you could put your sort of high-flying graduate trainees through that for a 6-month period, so that they're aware of the ways the world might start to change, and can then build that sort of flexibility and responsiveness into the structures as they progress through the organization. Okay, so in summary, I'd just like to say that yes, I think the BCG categorization of what makes a resilient organization is a very good way of thinking about that, and certainly building in resilience will help you to cope with the shocks of unanticipated events, which there are certainly always going to be. And I think recent years have shown us that they can be very unanticipated indeed. So of the elements of the BCG thing, I think the redundancy and flexibility are the two sort of really fundamental points. If you build those into your organization, you'll be better able to withstand the shocks. But I think it's even better to try and anticipate the future and to embrace the changes that are coming down the line, to respond to them and make yourself a more an organization which is better fitted for an inevitably different and new world. And really, that's all I wanted to take you through today. So here's some details if you wanted to stay in touch with us. So I'll hand back to Adrian to take us through any sort of questions you might have about what I've just run through.
Yes, Huw. There's one subject that's come up in quite a bit in the chat, and that was your term groupthink. John asked the question, could groupthink not be helpful in terms of company culture? And from my own background, we have brainstorming as a way of trying to get over problems. But you're suggesting no.
Yeah, there's a tension there, I think. Groupthink, yes, you want a culture, a corporate culture where people believe in the same values and the same concepts of what we're trying to achieve here. So at a high level, you're going to have that commonality of view and goals. But by groupthink, I meant the fact that you tend to get into a situation where often senior managers say, well, this is going to be the way forward, and build a culture around them of saying that challenges to that view are not acceptable. And then that inevitably leads you down a track where you're much more vulnerable to the shocks of the outside world. If you haven't considered the alternatives and you've all just agreed that this is the way forward, then you're actually laying yourself open to the challenges that the world might throw at you. So, I mean, your brainstorming is actually an example of trying to avoid the groupthink, and in particular, building scenarios is I think an excellent way of trying to avoid groupthink. If you've only got one view of the future, one view of how things are going to turn out, then that's almost certainly wrong, because nobody knows what the future is going to be. If you have 4 or 5 different views of how the future might work, even if they have visions that, or if they're images of the future that you don't like, then then you stand a chance of being able to build plans that respond to those circumstances. And when you see them starting to emerge, you can put those contingency plans into place. Does that help? John, I think, was the person who raised the question.
Yeah. We did have a couple of comments from Colin. First of all, the answer to groupthink, read Rebel Ideas by Matthew Said. And secondly, he's agreed with you and said there are a number of examples where an organisation agrees with itself, misses opportunities and threats, and he particularly quotes Boeing and the MAX 8 plane. So thank you to Colin for that. One from Suzanne. To help convince seniors, how can the cost benefits be articulated, as many of them will cost money?
Yes, this is a really challenging. It's a very good question, Suzanne. It's a really challenging point. How much you prepared to invest in your future? How much you prepared to, or conversely, how much risk are you prepared to accept by just running down one particular track? So it comes back to the sort of risk appetite of the organisation. How prepared to deal with risks are you? And what you're prepared to put aside to do it. Because yes, definitely, the building redundancy into your organisation is not efficient. It's not in the sense that we know it, and so it's an extra cost which some people might say you can't afford to bear. On the other hand, if you're facing an existential threat, if you're going to go completely out of business, then you needed to have prepared for that ahead of time. So it's a tricky one. I mean, it's when times are tight, and this probably was the NHS example. people thought that we couldn't afford to spend too much money on the NHS at that particular time. It's always going to be strapped for cash. And then the pandemic hits, and you don't have the resilience and flexibility that you might have hoped you had. Um, and it actually then looks to be a false economy that you've by that you've done. Um, so yeah, how you communicate that to senior managers, I think you communicate it by showing them the range of different outcomes that could come about, by getting them to step away from a narrow efficiency-minded approach of the future.
Okay, we don't have any more questions at the moment. So, unless
Okay, I mean,
anyone's going to come up.
I'd be just interested to get a feeling of the room as to how resilient do people think their organisations are at present. Has efficiency taken over from flexibility, do you think? I don't know if people like to show of hands or something about that, as to
Or
be
even in
interesting
the chat.
or even in the chat, yes, to get some perspective on, yeah, how resilient are organisations today? I mean, I think that organisations probably have recognised the needs for resilience because of the pandemic. I think that has shocked people into doing things differently, and starting to think about what a new normal might be like. So I think that has come through to an extent. Uh, see, there's a few more comments popping up in the chat.
Yeah. Efficiency has largely taken over, but we get a reset every now and then, usually after something goes wrong. Well, this is the shock. Still asking for lean training. My organisation, it isn't resilience or efficiency, it is implied cost cutting. But when an issue occurs, it's too deep.
I think, I think that's probably true of a large number of organisations, and that perhaps now is a time when there is an opportunity for an argument to be made to senior management, to the board, that that actually just driving for efficiency doesn't allow you to have this capability to respond when shocks occur. And shocks are going to occur. You've seen shocks occur in the last few years, and shocks are going to continue to occur. So how don't you want your organisation to be able to cope with those shocks when they do come? So thank you for those views. That's interesting to hear.
My organisation is quite old-fashioned and a little stuck in its ways. I suspect there may be a few companies out there that are of that ilk. Previous company was very reactive and not proactive, quite lazy stroke arrogant, and not willing to move with the times. I won't tell you what the company was, however.
There's also some interesting arguing about innovation, where companies sometimes only respond when a new competitor emerges and does something different and starts challenging them. But there are also examples where companies have invented new ideas themselves and then decided not to run with them because it's too much of a challenge for their existing business. Think particularly of Kodak, who invented digital cameras, but they carried on making film, and they stayed making film until the whole digital world really undermined that business model dramatically.
Certainly from the company that I work for, Huw, they are looking at and connecting with the supply chain, particularly around the use of electric vehicles, which in heavy construction are very few and far between. So I can see them looking at the fuel, certainly diesel and petrol are going to start costing an awful lot more post 2030.
Yep. Well, from now on, I think basically, yes.
Well,
yes. I mean, the Ukraine war is going to make fuel a big issue, isn't it?
yeah.
So it's just going to be more and more costly, and you've still got this. And it's no point saying we've got to park the net zero ambitions because there's been a war, because the planet will still suffer. So you're going to have to factor all of that into one big thing. And yes, electric vehicles is going to be a major theme of the answer.
Yeah.
I was reading recently about there was new hydrogen powered mining vehicles in South Africa, which was a way that they were looking to try and reduce their carbon emissions.
Couple of questions have just popped up. I have a question about large joint venture companies' engagement. And I would tend to agree with that certainly the large joint ventures that I've worked with, when it comes to the shock, you find yourself running in two different directions, or three or four, depending how many joint venture partners there are. Any advice?
Well, that is a tricky one, because the partners in the joint venture will have their own different cultures and their own different goals, and I think the only advice I could give there would be to very much tightly define what that joint venture is doing, and that's sort of isolated from its parent companies in a way that it creates its own culture, and therefore starts to think of itself in a more unified way. But I think that I can see that that's always going to be a challenge.
Yeah. The pandemic has resulted in my company becoming more flexible, more acceptance of change. Decentralization of decision making has also resulted. That all sounds good. The compilation of contingency plans, initially for COVID, now for other high risk matters, has assisted with developing a forward looking company.
Well, that sounds like an excellent model company then to be working with. The thing I'd say is that there's going to be a reaction against that decentralization at some point, and somebody is going to say it'll be more efficient if we all do things the same way. And I think you have to let the pendulum swing back and forth. There are benefits on both sides, and letting the pendulum swing means that you can actually start to see those different benefits in different situations.
Right. And on the subject of joint venture companies, comment about, well, I've seen this before, that not all joint venture partners have equal shares in the project. So again, I can see that would limit where the joint venture heads to.
Yeah, yeah, and it'll colour the sort of risk appetite of the different participants, won't it? How much
Yeah.
involvement they've actually got in it.
Right. I am going to stop the questions there, Huw. Would you mind awfully clicking the next slide on? And thank you very much, Huw, from both the committee and the membership that we've had attending this evening. Excellent topic.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure to present it. I hope that the people have found it an interesting and stimulating set of ideas.
Excellent. Would you mind just clicking again,